This conversation is brought to you ad-free thanks to the generous support of the Howl in the Wilderness Patreon community. To gain access to early release of all episodes, the full podcast archives, and other extras, visit patreon.com/Howl in the Wilderness. Paul Bishop, thanks for joining me on the podcast once again.
Well, thank you very much. It's my pleasure.
We're here to talk about the third installment in your series on Jung and the Epic of Transformation. And this one I find especially intriguing. It's about Jung's response to Nietzsche's Thus Spake Zarathustra, or Thus Spoke Zarathustra. I never know what the correct version is.
Either's fine.
But as Jung said, the archetypes speak in highfalutin language, so maybe Thus Spake Zarathustra is...
got more of a biblical ring to it.
Yeah, it's got more of that. Although I find that statement kind of humorous because it makes sense for like a Victorian person with literary aspirations. I don't think it's a universal truth that the archetypes always speak in that kind of language, but for Jung and Nietzsche, that was probably the case.
Absolutely. I'd agree with that.
Well, I thought this would be a really good opportunity as well for a kind of introduction to some of Nietzsche's big ideas, and of course, Jung's responses to them, which were very central to Jung's own idea formation. So maybe if you could just set the context for us a little bit, like how did Jung engage with Nietzsche? They were almost contemporaries. I mean, there was some overlap in their lives. So I'm wondering if we know anything about when Jung first encountered Nietzsche. And of course, we know that he did like years-long seminar on Thus Spake Zarathustra, so it was obviously a very provocative work for him. But do we know anything about when he encountered Nietzsche?
Well, what we do, we've got the evidence of what's in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, and now as a kind of supplement to it, the Jung's Life and Work, which is the kind of bits that didn't make it into the volume with Agnelli Jaffe. And they're pretty consistent in their story of how Jung finds his way to Nietzsche. And it's basically, I think, when he's a student that he picks up from people who are in the city, who remember the old days when you had Jakob Burckhardt, you had Bachhofen, and you had Nietzsche, and it was part of this great intellectual flourishing that took part in Basel, and Jung picks up on this. And is intrigued by it. At the same time, he comes across this almost barrier that's put around Nietzsche. The people are very worried by what he did, by what he says. They're worried about the attack on theology. They're worried about the consequences of that as they see it in the 10 years of what the Germans euphemistically call geistige Umnachtung. So in the dark depths of madness, those last 10 years when he's declined into insanity. So he's a kind of a provocative figure, a worrying figure, but also, and perhaps for those reasons for Jung, an enticing figure. And we know that he reads Zarathustra several times as a student, later on, and then again, and most significantly, as you mentioned, for that massive seminar that is held over many years, 1934 to 39, which is one of the big attempts to engage with what Zarathustra is really about. So I think we also pick up from occasional remarks that are made that are like the kind of golden thread that run through his collected works, and we can say, I think safely, that Nietzsche is of huge importance for Jung. He kind of defines the area that Jung himself wants to work in. At the same time, Jung has this kind of ambivalent appreciation, as it's been called. He says in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, he's recorded as saying, "I was worried that I might be too much like Nietzsche." And I think it sums up that ambivalence very well.
And they certainly shared some biographical details in common. Both of their fathers were ministers or pastors in the church.
That's right.
One thing I didn't know about Nietzsche before starting to investigate him over the past couple of years is that he was kind of like a prodigy philologist.
Yeah. Yeah.
He was made a professor of classics, Greek studies, at a very young age.
Yeah,
What?
no, that's right. He was the academic wunderkind of the time. He was a ferocious reader, a ferocious learner, a ferocious intellect as a student in the very rigorous school of Schulpforta, which is the way he'll have come across the classics. Then in his studies in Leipzig, and then at a very early age, 24, he is described by his doctoral father as the great future of philology. He represents the future as to where the subject is going to go, and he gets this appointment in Basel as a result. But of course, it only lasts again for about 10 years. And increasingly, one can say that the significance of Nietzsche lies in the departure from
Hmm.
philology, a departure from academia, you might say, leaving those things behind and turning his attention to what we might call the really serious business of living a life, constructing a life. How does one do that? And I think that Nietzsche, he doesn't just write philosophy, he lives it. And that's what also pulls Jung in, of course, as well, is here you've got a guy who actually takes these things seriously. Not just the sort of nice phrases, not just the floskel, not just the pretty little remarks that are sort of clever, but someone who engages with extraordinarily difficult questions, and he does so at a very personal level as well. I think that's also one of the hooks as far as Jung is concerned.
Yeah, I mean, Nietzsche took quite a left turn from the typical academic career of a classicist into living this philosophy and writing in a very unique style. Do we
Mm.
know anything? Like, was there a turning point for him? Did he have his own kind of metanoia or transformational experience that sent him in this direction?
That's a good question. I mean, conventionally, his work's divided into three periods, but I think it's kind of helpful. You start off with the birth of tragedy, which is a philological text, which at the same time is taking leave from philology because it doesn't read like an academic study. It's got no footnotes. Okay, so that's one of the first things that's going to worry the academic folk is okay, what's all this Apollo and Dionysius doing here in this discussion of Greek
Right, it
tragedy?
seems kind of like personal conjecture or something, like personal
That's
theory.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. So he's not just sort of citing all these secondary sources. It's putting forward a thesis, largely but not entirely original, because he does draw on ideas from other significant thinkers in the German Romantic tradition, like Schelling. I could mention in particular. At the same time, he is a big buddy of Richard Wagner. And he sees in Wagner a renaissance of Greek tragedy, a renaissance of the values of Greek tragedy, except that he falls out with Wagner because in the ring, everything turns to disaster. Wagner writes Parsifal, so you've got him going back to the Christian roots of Europe. That's not the way that Nietzsche wants to see what something that's really going to be, not just a music, but a philosophy of the future. So that's the first big kind of caesura. It's this moving away to what's then called his middle period, where he tends to write extended essays. Increasingly, over this period of time, he writes in an aphoristic style, and he sees the aphorism as the form which captures the kind of philosophical, the kind of existential work that he's trying to do, and this then culminates in Thus Spake Zarathustra, which is in some ways a kind of collection of aphorisms. I mean, we'll come on and talk about the as you say remarkable style that we find in Zarathustra, and that work also then is another turning point towards the late Nietzsche, where the aphorisms become even more condensed. He writes at a style which is increasingly cryptic, playful. I mean, the autobiography that he writes about himself, Ecce Homo, what a man. It's a biblical reference, and it's a kind of using it to almost kind of blasphemous application of it to himself. That the Antichrist, and he describes himself in his letter somewhere as being this kind of Antichrist-like figure. Some critics have seen in these works the incipient signs of that descent into madness. I'm skeptical about that because the sheer power and elegance and wit of the writing, it seems to be such, that's not how a mad person writes.
Yeah, but I mean, the notion that somebody would be so bold, so provocative, not at all worried about how other people saw them socially, that I think in that period would be seen as a kind of madness, this kind of natural, unconditioned, exuberant thinker, kind of gloves off, just kind of giving it to you the way he sees it, you know.
No, I think that's right, and there is a sense in which madness is defined by the society in which it finds itself as a kind of an expression or a kind of protest. At the same time, in the case of Nietzsche, it's likely that what caused the madness was an inherited condition which he got from his father, who died when he was very young. And in those 10 years where Nietzsche is incapacitated, and he doesn't write anymore, he's not able to look after himself. This is when he begins to be instrumentalized by the evil sister, by Elisabeth Förster Nietzsche. So it's the end of the road, I think, comes with the very last works, which are the Twilight of the Idols, and the Antichrist and Ecce Homo, and the book, which is often attributed to him as the kind of the last great summary of his thinking, the book called The Will to Power, is cobbled together by the sister, and in many ways has done Nietzsche a disservice. It's a useful repository of Nietzschean material, but it's tendentiously edited, and it hasn't done it in the history of his reception. It hasn't done Nietzsche any favors.
Right, because she had a particular agenda when putting that together.
That's right. That's
Yeah,
right.
to support National Socialism.
Her reading is one which will take the language of the will to power and give it a militaristic kind of meaning. I mean, it's certainly true that there is, shall we say, a dangerous ambiguity in some of Nietzsche's formulations. My reading, though, and I think anybody who seriously reads him will come to the conclusion that he's using the rhetoric of struggle, of the agon. It's an ancient Greek idea. Set him up against the Greeks that he was originally interested in, and I think that's where you get the true Nietzsche. To judge Nietzsche retrospectively in the light of what happens in the 30s and 40s, which happened for many years with Nietzsche, I think is to misrecognize the power of the thinker that we have in front of us.
Yeah, I think he's often maybe misunderstood as being nihilistic and amoral. But from the little that I've read of him, there seems to be a morality there, but it's a kind of an essential morality in the kind of
Mhm.
the animal body and the response to life. That there's an inherent morality that's not imposed by society. But I don't find him like amoralistic at all.
No, I would agree with that. I mean, one of the great questions he puts is, and how moral is our morality?
Yeah.
And I think he has in his target sights there to use a kind of military image of sorts. He has in mind Kant and Kant's idea of the categorical imperative and the idea that you can work out a moral position purely through reason, as indeed you can have a religion purely through reason. Nietzsche's skeptical about that, and he's skeptical about it because he sees it as the latest iteration of an idea of morality which is rooted in the Judeo-Christian tradition, and that's why he's, I think, a profound critic of Judeo-Christianity, not for reasons of ethnicity, but because he sees that what happens there, that's where in his view, you find the true nihilism. That is to say, that value comes through obedience to something that's handed down to you from above, but that above, in his view, doesn't really exist. He's the great anti-Platonic thinker
Hmm.
as well. These are just myths and lies which were invented by the priestly caste, as he puts it in Genealogy of Morals, and as a means of social control. And instead of that, you're absolutely right. He wants to propose a different kind of morality. It's going to be a reality which is outside the church, which is outside the Kantian tradition. It's going to be rooted in the body. It's going to be rooted in the unconscious. It would look very different from the kind of morality that he would have grown up with at Schulpforta. And I think that's one of the reasons that makes him such a forward-thinking, such a revolutionary thinker too. Thinker that we're still, more than 100 years on, trying to understand the implications of what he wrote.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, another thing that I discovered that you alluded to is that he wasn't a big fan of Plato, and that whole idea of well, the what do you call them? The kind of idealism
The
of
ideas,
Plato.
yeah, forms of the ideas, yeah.
Yeah, that there are somehow these transcendental forms that are, capital T truth, and everything kind of derives from that or is extended from that.
Yeah, no, that's right. It's this dualistic worldview. He characterizes it in Thus Spake Zarathustra as the belief of the backwoodsman. That is to say, this idea that there is something behind or above, separate from the world of time and space, the world of matter and emotion, that existential now. This is the reality that he thinks we have to face. We have to orientate ourselves around, not, as he would put it, the lies and fairy tales of those who are, in his view, nihilistic. I think the accusation of nihilism that's made against Nietzsche is extremely unfair, because what he's trying to in his view, it's Judeo-Christianity, it's Kant, it's that 19th century bourgeois outlook. There's the real nihilism, he says, because it's purely about social control. What he's proposing is something much more fragile, much more tentative, much more individual. It's a journey that the individual is going to go on, and that's why I think we see this turning away from essays and, as it were, logically argued argumentation to the aphorism, which is a kind of, like the French say, an aperçu. It's a flash, it's an insight. And that's the idea, I think, behind Zarathustra as well, that he's going to seek to engage his audience in a kind of unconscious, in a kind of emotional,
Hmm.
intuitive kind of way.
Yeah, that's my feeling about him too. And one of the things I appreciate is the way these aphorisms hit, and the way they stir something up in my own mind.
Mhm.
He's not laying it all out, and it's one of the things that really bores me about philosophy. It's just a lot of like blah blah blah. It's so verbose and explanatory, and you know, I just find it kind of exhausting mentally. I
Mhm.
very much appreciate that kind of emotional hit of the
Yeah,
aphorism. And I
yeah.
think I'm surprised that more philosophers in the Western tradition don't write in that way, because there's such a precedent for it. I mean, we can go back to Heraclitus's fragments, something like Lao Tzu or the Yoga
Mhm.
Sutras. It seems to be that he's kind of resurrecting this
Mhm.
form when no one else has done that in centuries maybe.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. One of the reasons why I think people don't is because it's incredibly difficult to do
Mm,
to pack so much material into such a limited form. I can think of one example of someone who I think kind of holds his own against Nietzsche in terms of the aphoristic style, and indeed who writes almost exclusively in aphorisms, and that would be the Romanian philosopher Emil Cioran.
mm,
Cioran, as he called himself in French, and Cioran's writing again deeply rooted in Nietzsche, but kind of anti-Nietzsche, because with Cioran, I think you'll confront one of the most ruthlessly and consistently negative. And one might on some occasions even say nihilistic thought. It's if you just look at some of his book titles, one of the most famous ones is "The Inconvenience of Being Born." That'll give you an idea of where Cioran's coming from.
cheery fellow.
Absolutely, yes, yeah.
Well, okay, thank you for all that. And then along comes Jung, and I just think there's something about Jung and some of these other kind of quote unquote great men,
Mhm.
and Jung himself kind of aspiring to be a great man.
Mhm.
When I read him, I can't help but think that he's somehow got like a real kind of competitive drive in him, that he wants to not only kind of deconstruct or dismantle some of these great men who he puts himself kind of in competition with, but also wants to kind of outdo them or
Mhm.
one up them. Like, he obviously was very affected by Thus Spake Zarathustra, which is, I don't know, kind of like a strange parable novel about this character who's kind of a mouthpiece for Nietzsche. You could see the whole thing as a kind of active imagination in the Jungian sense.
Mhm.
And Jung, when he writes something like The Seven Sermons to the Dead or his Red Book, I see that as him kind of trying to attempt to do the same thing in his own way, but never fully being able to give himself over to the, what would we say, to the archetypal in the way that Nietzsche did. And I think
Mhm.
that's one of the things that he was very cautious about and
Mhm.
critical of Nietzsche, that he went too far or gave himself over to the archetypes
Yeah.
at his own kind of downfall.
Yeah.
I mean, what do you think about that? Is this me projecting onto Jung this kind of competitive one-upsmanship, or do you think there's something to that?
No, no, I think that's bang on the button because think about his relation to Goethe, and he references this idea of that Goethe was my great great grandfather and so on. He's putting himself in the lineage, but at the same time, great 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 grandfather. There's the distance of generations there and so on. So there's that similar ambiguity. He says, I was fascinated by Nietzsche, really wanted to find out about him. Zarathustra was an incredible work to read, which absolutely it is. So it's not surprising that he says that. At the same time, he senses this fear that he's going to be like Nietzsche, which is, I think, that Nietzsche explores that archetypal realm without taking the kind of precautions that Jung is going to try and do when he creates the Red Book. So absolutely, the Red Book I would see as you suggest, a reaction and a response to Zarathustra. It's his own kind of Zarathustra. That is to say, it's a work which engages its audience, sure, on a propositional level, but not only that, it's also reaching down into the unconscious, into the intuitive side of the individual reader. So whilst they're not identical, I think they have a similar strategy about how they're going to take the reader and turn the reader upside down.
Hmm. I think a key difference, though, is that Jung was kind of incurably bourgeois. I don't think he could ever give up the kind of luxurious life that he had or the esteem of colleagues. It seems like that was always something he was really concerned about upholding. And kind of, maybe that's the reason why he hid things like the Seven Sermons or the Red Book. He didn't, publish them widely. And Nietzsche just kind of went all in, and it sounds like he was critical of the bourgeois. And so his kind of living in poverty, living alone, things that Jung saw as a kind of a failure in living out his philosophy, proof that you couldn't live his philosophy and have a successful life. Whereas Jung's living in this palatial home, he's kind of like privileged enough to have this piece of land where he can build his castle and all that kind of thing, right? So that seems to be kind of an interesting struggle or difference between the two.
I think you put your finger on something important there. Of course, you could spin it the other way and say that that there is an aspect of Jung which is immensely pragmatic. Hey, if you're in a bourgeois society, then you might as well be well and truly rooted in it with the second most rich industrialist's daughter as your wife, and this beautiful house and Kusenach and the Bollingen Castle and so on, as you say. And in fact, he makes that point more or less in those terms in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, where he says, I was rooted in society. I was rooted in my family. And Nietzsche didn't have that. And that's why he was blown in the wind hither and hither and thither. And I think there is that sense that there's a pragmatic side to Jung, which absolutely wants to engage with the archetypal realm, but is also concerned with living a decent life in the here and now. In the case of Nietzsche, I think he suffers very much from this lack of an interlocutor. He doesn't find it with academia. He doesn't find it more generally. There is significantly no Mrs. Nietzsche. The love affairs never work out. The encounter with Lou von Salome almost destroys him, as indeed almost anybody who had a relationship with Lou von Salome seems to have got their fingers burnt one way or another. He's got enough money to live on a pension and travel around, but as you say, he's living in the cheapest accommodation. It's by no means a luxurious lifestyle, and part of that is by choice. And part of that, I think, is by circumstance and his acceptance of that circumstance. So I think you're right that there is perhaps a characteristic or maybe a typological difference. Perhaps we could use Jung to explain that, a typological difference between Jung on the one hand and this pragmatic aspect to him and Nietzsche, and that absence of any kind of rooting in society, and as Nietzsche and as Jung says, Nietzsche is blown around hither and thither like the wind. It's an image which I think captures that fragility that's there in Nietzsche.
Yeah, I can't help but think though that Jung justifying his kind of caution in engaging with the archetypes and not going all in and keeping 2 feet on the ground and 1 foot in the family world and all that kind of thing. You could read that as a kind of cope, as the kids would say, a way to kind of justify his choices. 'Cause I do really feel that there was something in him that really desired to kind of go full mystic. And it always seems like he's playing like 1 foot in the kind of the bourgeois society and 1 foot in the mystic. And I think he did admire people who went all in. And I say that not only because of his reaction to Nietzsche and his criticism of him, but also his reaction to people like Rudolf Steiner and the Theosophists and Annie Besant and Madame Blavatsky. He was obviously fascinated by these people and the works they created, but just couldn't allow himself to go there. And I think when we look at their lives, obviously, like Jung made some good choices, and he seemed to have lived a better life by most accounts. So I'm not being critical of him, but I just find it very interesting. There always seems to me like a kind of a tension when I read him writing about other people. Who are working in this spiritual or mystic area.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair comment, and there is a view of there is a reading of Jung which does stress that mystical side or did that prophetic aspect of Jung, and I think one can see how that sort of aligns with Nietzsche as well. Um, it's interesting that Steiner, whom you mentioned, was also one of the first people who wrote seriously and intelligently about Nietzsche. And he was invited to work at the archive in Weimar. And he wrote a beautiful little book on Nietzsche, Nietzsche ein Kämpfer seiner Zeit, an antagonist, a fighter against his age. I think
Huh.
it's translated,
I
and
didn't know
it's
that. I
oh
didn't
yeah,
know he engaged with Nietzsche.
no, absolutely, he does very early on. Um, Less, I think so, as anthroposophy begins to develop, but he's certainly a seminal figure for Steiner right at the beginning, and I think one can still read today Nietzsche, a fighter against his age, with that it's a worthwhile essay to read.
Hmm. Interesting that both Steiner and Jung were engaging with Nietzsche, but both of them, in their own way, kind of stuck with Christianity. Although Steiner had his own kind of unique take on it, and I think Jung did as well, actually. But they both, I don't know, couldn't leave that for some reason.
I think that's fair comment. I mean, there is a remark I think made by Jung somewhere, isn't there, in volume 11, where he's looking at religion, East and West, where he suggests that and all this interest in Indian philosophy and in Buddhism and Taoism, Chinese thought, that's all well and good, but that's not our world. And I think there is an aspect of him which is, I mean, he's clearly interested in it, as is witnessed by the writings collected in volume 11. But there's also a sense, and I think we touched on this when we were looking at the role the Grail legend plays in Jung's thought, that Jung saw himself as having a particular task, that is to bring the Grail back to the West, to revive the myths of the West. And that doesn't mean he's not interested in other cultures or other attempts to awaken or re-experience this mythic dimension. It's just that he feels that there's a particular gap there in the West, and that he, Jung, is able to fill it. And I think Steiner is probably in line with this idea as well, even though he might be more open to, shall we say, sort of Eastern mysticism and Eastern influences in his thought. You could look at it in terms of they can't get out of the Christian paradigm. You could also look at it and say, well, one of the things they're trying to argue is that that's the way that we are culturally and intellectually wired to think. So we've got to engage with that. And I think that's what lies behind the whole rhetoric about the death of God, is that it's a very specific God that's dead. Just as in the Red Book, it's a very specific God, is Dubar, who is dead and has to be brought back thanks to Jung again.
Mm. Well, let's get into that. So, some of Nietzsche's key ideas that are present in Zarathustra, but not only in that text, but we're speaking about this text and Jung's response to it. So, I mean, the most famous Nietzschean idea or statement or declaration that God is dead, which has been turned into t-shirts and bumper stickers, in contrast with, well, Jung's response being something more like, his famous saying that the gods have become diseases, that they've
Mhm.
been internalized and are still kind of active in the unconscious, but also his idea that God is sick and needs us to heal him, something like that, right?
Yeah, yeah, no, that's right. Um, that this phrase "God is dead" comes in aphorism 125, section 125 of a book called "The Gay Science," the cheerful science, die fröhliche Wissenschaft, and is kind of part of the essential backdrop what he then goes on and does in Zarathustra. And in the gay science, we have this almost kind of parable of the madman with a lamp at midday, and clearly he's mad because you don't need a lamp at midday, running around trying to find God and unable to find him, and everybody laughs at him. And then he turns to them and says, "Well, the reason why I can't find God is because God is dead, and we have killed him." And it's a remarkable piece of writing. I mean, I'd invite anybody to go and read that and not feel that it tugs at them or provokes them in some kind of a way. It's an extraordinarily powerful piece of writing.
Right. It can't be just easily dismissed.
No, 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 absolutely not. And I think it's significant that he doesn't say there is no God, the as it were conventional atheist position. It's that God is dead and we have killed him. What does he mean by that? Is, well, the Platonic sun, the good, the true, the beautiful, this realm of sheer otherness, that he thinks no longer exists for us, and that creates a huge turmoil. It's he says it's going to take us years, decades, centuries to work out the implication of this momentous deed. How are we going to live without the Platonic, the one and the good? How are we going to live without the Judeo-Christian monotheistic deity? How are we going to live without the God of reason proposed by Kant? You can't just turn your back on these things because they are part of the matrix out of which we have evolved, with all our neuroses, with all our misunderstandings, with all our nihilistic tendencies. So it's a real piece of work that Nietzsche is taking on here in this announcement. I wouldn't put it on my bumper sticker in case the person on the car behind me read it and forgot to brake.
Yeah. So Jung's idea. I mean, I've heard both things, right? Like, can they be correlated? This idea that the gods have become diseases and that God is sick, or is he writing from kind of in two different modes there?
I think those are different ways of expressing this same idea that you find in Nietzsche. God is sick, or he is a disease, or he is dead, and we have killed him. These are obviously metaphors, but they are powerful ones. And unpacking the implications of it, that's what Nietzsche's philosophy is concerned to do. That's what I would see Jung's psychoanalysis, Jung's analytical psychology as being as much an answer to that, is trying to understand this predicament, where it's not simply the absence of a deity. It's what is that? It's the psychological impact that has. Um, and I think his own experience, Jung's own experience with religion, with organized religion, is one where he thinks, but it's just not going to work anymore. And I go along to the communion service, and I have this piece of bread, and that's it, and it's all over, and then everybody goes home again. And this is kind of shocks him to the core, because he's aware, on the other hand, of this kind of shocking vision that he has of the deity that defecates on the roof of Basel Cathedral. That is very, 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 very different. Obviously, very, very different. But is disturbing as well, that God is something wonderful and something terrible. And this wonderful and terrible thing has kind of become untethered from the culture in which we find ourselves again. Therefore, not a surprise, I think, that as well as dealing with this question of the death of God explicitly in the Seven Sermons to the Dead and in their iteration in the Red Book, that right at the end of Jung's life, 1952, what do we find him working on Answer to Job? And again, this question of what is the deity, and how do we respond to a deity who allows evil things to happen? And Answer to Job, I think, is in many ways the kind of the last thinking through of
Hmm.
this response, this problematic of how to respond to the idea of the death of God, which I think links the very earliest, the very latest thoughts of Jung. They all come together as this single project to answer this epochal question, which I think we're still, as a society and a culture, struggling to come to terms with today.
Yeah. I mean, I think Jung would probably agree with this, that it's not so much that God has died, but our ways of relating to the divine have become irrelevant or stale or lifeless. You know, that's his critique of the Protestant church, right?
Mhm.
And I think toward the end of his life, he was looking forward to some new religion of the future that was being developed. You know, and his prophecy was that it would probably take something like 500 years and reach kind of building our own support of that new religion, which sounds like it would be a global kind of thing, you know, some
Mhm.
bigger shared cosmology or something. But yet he's still really captured by this idea of God, you know, the monotheistic God. I find that really interesting, because he always he played with kind of polytheism in a way, but it was always seems to be psychologized, but
Mhm.
kind of remaining a monotheist to the end, you know, replacing God with self, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
I just find that very curious. Like, I don't know, do you think it was ever something that was resolved in him?
Um, Hard to say. It's hard to judge what happens in the innermost heart of an individual. But let me just take us back to another formulation, which I think helps us understand Nietzsche and Jung's response to it, and that is at the very end of Ecce Homo, which is playing with the idea of that's the language that's used when Pontius Pilate is shown the figure of Christ before the crucifixion. But at the very end of this book, apparently his autobiography, supposedly a kind of autobiographical study, we find a single aphorism, and it's so simple linguistically, but so dense in terms of its implications. And it goes like this. Nietzsche says, have I been understood? Dionysus against the crucified. And I think the denseness of that that is also a challenge for us to engage with. Well, how do we understand that? It's not the God of the philosophers. It's not the sort of the Deus ex machina. It's not the rationalistic deity. It's not the God of the clockwork universe. But Dionysus against the crucified is this fundamental opposition that Nietzsche sees in how we lead our lives. And I think that that's also a challenge that Jung picks up on in trying to understand what that aphorism means. And how do we revive the Dionysian side, and yet at the same time recognize that we are culturally, historically indebted in a way that we cannot simply erase to Christianity as well? How do these two opposites relate to each other? And of
Right.
course, Jung, I think, with his idea of the conjunctiva positorum, and Jung is much happier, I think, at coping with opposites. He's a great thinker for that. Nietzsche less so because, well, that isn't his bag. But I think that Jung is well placed for enables to see that it's not just Nietzsche against the crucified. In a sense, it's also Nietzsche with the crucified as well. And I back that up by pointing to the curious fact that 20th century theologians can't get enough Nietzsche. That they I've written about this in a book about Nietzsche and the crisis of faith, and to point to examples in German culture, Swiss, French, Italian, that you get thinker after thinker. Henri de Lubac being one, René Girard being one, Hans Küng being. You could keep going on. The theologians themselves, in many ways, are the best interpreters of Nietzsche. And in a way, that's bringing to truth the comment that Zarathustra makes at one point in Thus Spake Zarathustra, where he says, "Be careful not to wake the priests," he says, because actually it's the priests that I get on with very well. And that curious remark, I think, to me, makes sense in the way that Nietzsche has enjoyed this reception amongst the theologians, and enjoyed this reception by Jung as well, who doesn't simply point to Nietzsche as being, oh well, look, there's a guy who danced too heavily with the archetypes, and look, it all ended in disaster for him. But that he says, look, Nietzsche's providing a diagnosis of our time, and what a time, 1934 to 39. What a time to be providing a cultural, a political diagnosis, and therefore he is of immense significance to us. So forget about the madness of Nietzsche, and engage with this question that Nietzsche asks: have I been understood? And it raised this possibility that, perhaps we're still getting Nietzsche wrong in some ways, and that this formula, Dionysius against the crucified, that lays out a kind of project which, to me, it seems that the analytical psychology is exploring both of those dimensions. His interest in Christianity, the rituals of the Mass, and so on, and his interest in the figure of Dionysius.
Yeah, what an intriguing statement. Have I been understood, Dionysus versus the crucified?
Mhm.
What's he pointing to there, that that his work was really centrally about this conflict between the Dionysian and the god who could die?
Mhm.
I'm just thinking about Carl Karenyi's book on Dionysus,
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
archetype of indestructible life.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's where I would see a kind of contrast or difference between Dionysus and Christ who was crucified. Is that,
Crucified, but then raised from the dead. And
but
Dionysus is
but through an
also
ascension, whereas Dionysus like lives eternally in the earth in capital L life.
okay. Uh, I, 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 I'm not going to propose a kind of theological defense of one side of the equation as against the other. That's not what I want. What I want to do.
Hmm.
I just want to note the fact that, I mean, in this book called The Antichrist, that Nietzsche writes, who is the Antichrist? Is it Nietzsche himself, or is it the church? Because one of the things one notes in his book, The Antichrist, is that he says there was only one true Christian,
Hmm.
and he died on the cross.
Yeah.
It's all the work of St. Paul and thinkers who come, the church fathers and so on, who come in the wake of St. Paul, and in Nietzsche's view, they have corrupted this gospel, this evangelium, this good news, into a disevangelium, into a bad news, into a kind of nihilistic cult which has lasted for centuries. So there is, within the way that argument is constructed, it seems to me, a space in which he's not critical of Christ. Precisely that.
Hmm. Yeah. Interesting. I wonder if we could talk some more about the his concept of the Dionysian versus the Apollonian, because
Yeah,
that's something that Jung also responded to.
yeah,
Um, yeah, could you just kind of lay out what that distinction is
yeah. Sure.
that Nietzsche first made?
Yeah, absolutely. The text one needs to look at for this is the big book that he wrote as an academic, The Birth of Tragedy. The Birth of Tragedy, where there's a subtitle, Out of the Spirit of Music. And there's a lot about Greek tragedy in this book, but there's a lot about Wagner as well, which is in the background and sometimes not so much in the background. And right in the earliest pages, Nietzsche sets up a dichotomy between what he calls Triebe, drives, and artistic deities, Kunstgottheiten. And that leaves to me a kind of question mark over, well, actually, what are these categories? How are we actually to understand them? The categories being on the one hand Apollo, the god of light, of precision, of clear lines, of rationality, of control, and then the polar opposite of Dionysus, the wild dancing, the drinking, the unfettered, the unbounded, and these two forces, on the account that Nietzsche offers, fuse together to offer us Greek tragedy, which has elements of both. You have the Dionysian chorus, which whirls around the stage, and you have the statuesque Apolline figures of the actors declaring their lines. And because Apollo and Dionysus are gods or artistic deities or instinctual drives, therefore this means that we also have access to Greek tragedy. And I think that in our time where I know you have the sort of the great books movement in America, which is a kind of response to this, but we have become immense as a culture in the West immensely disconnected from the Greeks and from Greek tragedy in particular. I know that Christopher Nolan's doing his best to bring back the Odyssey, and that's a conversation for another day, I'm sure. But Nietzsche actually, I think, opens up Greek tragedy. It's a really, I think, helpful way of introducing us to the tragic corpus of Greek literature. But it's more than that, because it's also about how do we lead our lives? How do we balance the Apolline on the one hand? This very maybe Apollo in his modern form has got a little bit of the bourgeois about him, and on the other, the Dionysian, the instinctual, the risk taking, the dangerous. How do these two sides, conscious and unconscious, instinct and intellect, how are they to fuse together in our own lives? So sure, it's about Greek tragedy and Greek art, but it's also about us and about our existences, or to use the figure of speech that Nietzsche uses, how we construct our own lives like a work of art as well.
Hmm. Yeah, I love that that term, the artistic deities.
Hmm.
So not taking them literally, but seeing them as kind of products of artistic imagination and like the writing about them, the plays or the artworks. Um, yeah, so is that his way of kind of pointing toward something archetypal, which would be,
I
term
think
that
I think
Jung
yeah,
coined
no,
later?
absolutely. I think that's a very very fair reading of it. I think it's the reading that Jung gives, which is to say, what Nietzsche isn't clear about with these artistic deities is that they are deities, and that Dionysus, as it were, is there's a passage in an early essay where Jung says anybody who gives up Christianity also gives up the mantle of protection that it gives them. And I think that's a good way of understanding his approach to Christianity. He appreciates its seriousness, but at the same time, it's also a critique of it. And what does Christianity protect us in this on this account against? Well, it is precisely an excess of Dionysianism, a Dionysus which needs to have its a Pauline guidance given to it in order for it to become fruitful, in order for us to be able to construct our lives out of instinct and passion, but also out of a kind of pragmatism and a realism as well.
Right, because
So
uncontained, it would be destructive, which is kind of
exactly,
the reading that Jung had of Nietzsche, was that he gave himself over to the Dionysian too much, and look at the way
that's
his
right.
life turned out, basically, right?
That's right. Yeah, yeah. That's it. Yeah.
Yeah, so you could even think about like Jung's psychology as being another way to contain all of these different energies in analysis and in practices like the dream work or the active imagination when, he felt that the religious forms no longer functioned in a creative or a good way. Here's something else, a way to stay engaged with the Dionysian and, all the other energies too, but to do it in a kind of contained way that wouldn't destroy your life, basically.
No, absolutely. I think you've expressed that very, very well, and that also shows, I think, the extent to which one can see analytical psychology as, in its core, as a reaction and a response to this challenge that Nietzsche presents us with, and that Jung is, with his immense cultural knowledge, both of the world of antiquity and in everything that comes in between, and in the modern age, is in some ways almost uniquely placed to undertake that kind of synthesis, that union of the opposites that Nietzsche diagnoses, exemplifies, lays out for us, but is ultimately unable to resolve.
Because he's unable to live that union of the opposites of the Apollonian and the Dionysian.
That's right. Yes.
Yeah. And you kind of look at Jung and see that that's what he was striving to do his whole life. Even when he talks about personality number one and personality number two, personality number one being the kind of the public facing, the bourgeois, the upstanding citizen, the academic, the scholar with credentials and legitimacy, versus personality number two that was having all these kind of Dionysian experiences of dissent and ecstasy, loss of self and all of that kind of thing. Yeah.
Now, I mean, the what I would resist is a kind of biographical reading, which some people would give, where you kind of look at Nietzsche and the sad existence, as some people would see it, the lack of company. If you read his letters, he's always moaning about things and asking to be sent sort of different sorts of trousers and some more sausages and things like that. But I think that would be to overly biographicize it. In the read, and we should remember as well that Nietzsche was also writing as an individual who had great illness. I mean, he'd have terrible headaches. He was not a healthy man in many ways, having to live in these pensionen, listen to fellow tourists talking at lunchtime and so on. And he wasn't going to share his identity. Certainly wasn't going to share his ideas with them. But what does he do? He goes for walks. And then this very simple activity acquires an immensely symbolic dimension to it. He says, I only trust the thoughts you should only trust the thoughts that come to you when you're walking, because there you are, you feel the ground beneath your feet. He likes walking, as we know, in Sils Maria, up in the Swiss mountains, just as in the mountainous regions of France and Italy, and this walking up the mountain is symbolic in so many ways. It's so very, very physical. It's so very, very individualistic. Okay, you've got to get up there and back again. And it's also a kind of symbolic act. The mountain up which Moses goes to receive the 10 tablets. Nietzsche's going to go up the mountain. He's not going to receive 10 tablets because there aren't 10 tablets to be received. But it's going to be his experience of that height, the rarefied air. There's a line in Zarathustra where Zarathustra says, you should learn to live in mountains. Why? Because you're above everybody else. You're above the culture. You're above the day to day. You're above the social media. You can understand just what a small world it is when you see it from that perspective of being up there. And in some ways, I think Nietzsche would have made the great first astronaut as well. To see the Earth from above, to see it from its elevated position in its beauty and its fragility, but also its failure to understand its immensely marginal position, and it will invent legends and myths to give it a kind of self-aggrandizing role. So sounds as if, what a very limited life where he goes walking all the time, but built into that is an entire philosophy and an entire program. It's also immensely practical. You can invite people to go for walks and to experience what is it that they experience when they're walking. So there's a kind of philosophical praxis which is built into this idea of leading a life in the mountains as well.
Yeah, and it's very physical and embodied. You could
Exactly.
say that it's up to you to climb the mountain and write your own commandments, perhaps.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I guess what
Definitely.
you're saying is like not falling into what I think you called in the book biographical reductionism,
Mhm.
is not just kind of painting Nietzsche's life as one big miserable failure, thus being evidence that, well, this is what happens when you give yourself over to the Dionysian. Is that what you're saying? Is that
Yeah.
we shouldn't be too quick to dismiss the way he lived his life and how it turned out as, as a marker of success or not, or validity of his ideas? To watch or listen to the full episode, become a free or paid member by visiting patreon.com/Howl in the Wilderness, or by downloading the Patreon app to your mobile device. Paid memberships start at just $5 a month and offer a number of benefits, including early access to all episodes, the full podcast archives, and the satisfaction of knowing that you're supporting an independent creator directly. Thanks.